So thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. It's quite a change from where I began with this field almost 20 years ago. As a cadet at the aforementioned Air Force Academy, the extent of our cyber knowledge at the time was learning how to program in Pascal, and a few of my friends deciding that we wanted to play a first-person shooter called Doom. Some of you may have heard about it. And there you go. And we wanted to be the first at the Air Force Academy to play it. So we took over the Falcon Net, and we were essentially the only people on the network because they had just put it into the walls. And we learned how to play and played that game. And no one caught us, which is probably true to this day. Now, Doom can be played on things like printers. There have been hacks where people have taken over HP printers, and on the little LCD display, you can play Doom. So we've come quite a long ways. The second aspect about this that really impresses me is the extent, and I'll have to give the Army some credit here, Greg. By the way, thanks, Greg, for the opportunity to be here. The extent to which the Army has institutionalized this profession. When I started, it was all about what I would call heroics. You had people who had volunteered, were hand-selected, who begged, borrowed, or stole their way into the very, very few units that existed to do this sort of work. My own story was along those lines. I was stationed at Security Hill at Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio, where the Air Force Information Warfare Center was located. Although I had a really boring information warfare policy job, and I wanted to do more of the warfare and less of the policy. So I begged and begged and begged for about a year to try to find a way into the Information Warfare Center as opposed to being an air intelligence agency. And the part that pushed me over the edge was when I volunteered to create a new website for the AFCERT. I had essentially taught myself how to code in HTML, which back then was a big deal, because you could get good jobs. Think about this, in 1997, 1998, learning how to code HTML. So after about 3 days of redesigning the AFCERT's webpage, I turned to the person sitting next to me, and I said, "So what are you doing?" And they said, "Well, I'm watching an attack from Russia." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting." And I turned to the person left of me and said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm looking at an attack from China." "Oh, really? Well, how do you know that?" And they started to teach me what they were looking at, what it meant. I found a schedule that showed a 1-month boot camp that was coming up for learning how to do attack, defend, networking, all sorts of things. So I just surreptitiously added my name to that boot camp, disappeared for a month, learned all these wonderful skills. All the whole while, people are saying, "Who's that captain? Where did he come from?" Soon, I was back into the unit. I started looking for open slots on the schedule, mostly nighttime, because people didn't want to work the graveyard shift. And within a few months, I was in charge. We had run out of officers who knew enough and who were at the right place and time to run the detection mission. So I was de facto the guy running the detection operation at the AFCERT. So we've gone from that to the point where I see all these people who have jobs, who have career fields now, who have a career path, who can take this forward. And I think my generation is the group that will be either helping to teach you or, to some degree, being the civilian leadership for these services. Your group, I believe, is going to be the one who will be fighting the wars, because I do believe something like that is going to be coming down the pike. And the generation after you, I believe, is probably going to be the one that will have its own cyber force, because I don't think we're going to get that until there is some sort of catastrophe along the scale of a world war like we had with the creation of the Air Force. Now, I hope that my prediction doesn't come true, but that, by different standards, some may think we're already in a conflict, some may not. So I want to talk a little bit about that conflict. And I didn't know I was supposed to be edgy, but this is perfect. This is why I try to stay loose as far as the topics I'm going to discuss. What I'd like to talk about is some of the themes I've been researching and how they apply and whether there's a way out of this conundrum that I'm going to tell you about. So one of the things I've noticed is that if you really boil it down, many, many people out there, and maybe even some of you think this as well, believe that defense in cyberspace is simultaneously easy, slow, and hopeless. Easy, slow, and hopeless. And I didn't put easy and hopeless next to each other. I've got slow in between to sort of reduce the cognitive dissonance. Let me explain what that means. Easy. Depending on who you talk to, you will often hear that, well, if you just applied the patch, you would have been fine. If you had just done the top 4 elements of the Australian Defense Signals Directorate recommendations, controls in cyberspace, you would have reduced what percentage of intrusions? 80%. Who knows? It's just 80% is the right statistic for just about anything. You would have, right? If you just did cyber hygiene, you would be fine. So apparently, cyber is easy. In fact, there are even some scholars, and I brought my notes here, some scholars like Dr. Martin Libicki, who's a friend of mine, but guess what, Martin? You're going to get it today. In his 2009 book, Cyber Deterrence, he said that there is, in the end, no forced entry in cyberspace. It is only a modest exaggeration to say that organizations are vulnerable to cyber attacks only to the extent they want to be. In other words, it's their fault. What's worse about this is that others are building upon that, in my opinion, flawed assumption. So now we have a new generation of researchers. Martin is like an old school nuclear theorist. Now we've got young guys who have never done anything in cyberspace except like read email. And they're saying things like, when one state infiltrates another in cyberspace, it is often due to the obvious weaknesses in the target's defenses. Citing Libicki, he makes the point that cyber disputes happen because systems have flaws. So apparently, if we just took care of the flaws, things would be fine. You see this quite often with the secure coding world, right? Another friend of mine, Gary McGraw, says that the place we have to start is with securing software. Now, I don't disagree that we need to have more secure software, but is that really, at the end of the day, the whole problem? So, easy. Cyber defense is easy. And by the way, I know this is an Army conference, so I'm saying cyber a lot. It's also in DC, and there's no jokes about. Nobody laughed about that. If you went to the West Coast and you gave this talk and you said cyber as many times, every time people would be just, no. It's a drinking game, exactly. Yeah. So keep that in mind when you interact with your colleagues from outside of this area. Okay. So easy. The second assumption: defense in this digital arena is slow. The converse of that, or I should say the component to that, is that attacks are fast. You hear this all the time. A couple other quotes. General Alexander, another pseudo-friend of mine. Not really. I just impressed my wife once. We went to the White House Correspondents' Brunch, and I walked right in, and right in front of me was General Alexander. And he knew me from Mandiant, so I just started talking to him. And my wife said, "You know that nice old man?" And I said, "Yeah, it's General Alexander, former director of the NSA." And of course, that impressed my wife. But anyway, so General Alexander testified. He said this many, many times, and I want to give you an exact quote. In testimony to the House Armed Services Committee in March 2012, he said, "In terms of attack, cyber attacks, it is over before you know what happened. These happen at lightning speed." Former Secretary of the Air Force, Michael Donnelly, testifying in March of 2012, he said, "This OODA loop," and many of us, because of our military background, we know that's the observe, orient, decide, and act loop, invented by the Air Force, but picked up by the Marine Corps. This OODA loop operates at network speed. And I'll give you the trifecta of the speed of light, and this comes from my friends at the fort, not this fort, the fort north of here. In their slides, as released by Lord Voldemort, otherwise known as Edward Snowden, he said that there were slides that were presented there that said the fort could exploit its targets, quote, at the speed of light. So we have this perception that attacks happen like this. And if the consequences of that is if you miss it, you're dead. Now, this is already kind of weird. We have defense is easy because you just need to apply the patches. Attacks happen very, very fast at the speed of light, network speed, and so forth. So in some ways, this leads to the third conclusion, which is defense is hopeless. And the hopelessness is typified by this idea that offense dominates defense in cyberspace. So a couple of ideas of where this came from. In 2010, two more of my friends, you can get this idea. I know all these people because I've been around forever, right? I'm an old dude. Dr. Gregory Rattray, who incidentally was one of my professors at the Air Force Academy, and Jay Healy, who was one of my classmates, They wrote that cyberspace is a domain in which the offense generally dominates the defense. That same year, General Hayden, you all know him as the director of the NSA and the CIA, he said at the Black Hat keynote that year, the inherent geography of this domain is everything plays to the offense. There's almost nothing inherent in the domain that plays to the defense. So to me, that sounds like it's hopeless if you're a defender. You're going to get hit because offense is dominant. You're not going to know it probably because it happens so fast. It's just going to sweep right over you. And you're also probably stupid and negligent because you didn't patch, and that would have taken care of the problem. Or if you'd simply scrubbed yourself, you would have had cyber hygiene taken care of it. Well, my friends, I'm going to challenge every one of those. I don't believe in any of that. In fact, I'm writing a whole PhD around it. So I'm going to tell you a story that gives you a flavor of why I don't think any of those things are true. And the story comes from one of the very few public intrusions that I would consider to be strategically significant that is in the open discourse. That's one of the problems we have in our field is I'm a historian by trade, and it is very difficult to find cases to work with because NDAs, people don't want to reveal their defenses, people don't want to be shamed, they still feel negligent, lawsuits, and so forth. But the case I'm going to talk to you about is one that was in the news, and it was in the news about the news. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the 2013 story by the New York Times about their own intrusion. So I'm fascinated by any intrusions that are reported because I look for these elements of ease, speed, and who dominated, offense or defense. So if you don't know the story of the New York Times, let me just refresh your memory with a couple of key ideas. So the New York Times was working on a story on the finances of the then premier, so the number 2 in China, a guy named Wen Jiabao. And this guy was referred to in China as Grandpa Wen. He was seen as sort of this sort of doddering old guy who was liked by the people. He was seen as fairly clean, as opposed to this high level of corruption over there. Well, the New York Times had heard stories that the Wen family was actually worth billions. Maybe not Grandpa Wen himself, but the family. So they began an investigative expose to find out whether this was true. Well, apparently the Chinese government got wind of this. And the day before the story was to break, so October 24th, 2012, the Chinese government sent a delegation to the New York Times editorial office in New York City. And they said, we know you're going to publish this story tomorrow. So immediately, ding, 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 warning bells. Whoa, this is interesting. We're going to know you're going to publish this story tomorrow. If you publish it, there will be grave consequences. So what do you think the New York Times did? They published, because they are fine Americans, right? So they published the story. Several things happened that day. The first thing that happens is China cuts off all access to the New York Times inside their country. So today, when you're reading President Xi Jinping saying that they encourage foreign journalists, remember the New York Times and many other newspapers are blocked. And if you ever want to see what's blocked in China, go to en.greatfire.org. It's a website that tracks what's blocked in and out of China. So New York Times gets blocked. The second thing that happens is the New York Times says, grave consequences. We've seen that our website was blocked. I wonder if anything is happening to us. Like, how did they know that we were going to publish this story? So they approach their managed security provider and say, hey, let us know if you've seen anything suspicious happening, which I would have hoped they would have already been doing that, but a lot of MSSPs are kind of like sleeping and just collecting checks, but okay, not our MSSP. We are the finest in the world. So the MSSP comes back and says, we've noticed activity that is suspiciously consistent with state-sponsored activity coming out of the Chinese military. Oh, well, I wish you had told us that earlier, but okay, fine. Turns out that day they find out that they have a serious intrusion on their hands. So they spend about a week, 10 days wrestling with it, and then they do what a lot of people end up doing is they call us on November 7th. So we sent a team out there, and we start identifying what's going on. And what we found was that this newspaper, the New York Times, had been infiltrated by a group called APT-12. Not APT-1 like we did the report in 2013. This is another group, APT-12. APT-12, we found out, had been in the network since September 13th. Now, this is where the whole time and speed and all that stuff starts to come into play. They got into the network on September 13th, we believe by phishing. How long do you think it took before they leveraged their initial access to when they went after something that mattered, like the domain controller? How many people thought it took seconds? I guess I should have started with nanoseconds. Any nanosecond takers? Any speed of light takers? No, okay. How many people thought it took minutes? Oh, you're on to me. Okay, wait a couple. Hours, days, weeks, months. Okay. Turns out it took 2 weeks before they pivoted from their initial access to when they got to the domain controller. 2 weeks. Now, what does that tell you? But by the way, if you don't know what a domain controller is, it's essentially keys to the kingdom of any Windows network. You get to the domain controller, you can pretty much leverage that to get access to anybody else. So what that means, essentially, is that if at any point during that 2-week period, the New York Times, its MSSP, somebody else, the FBI, had noticed that there were Chinese intruders inside the New York Times, they would have prevented them from getting additional access to the corporate resources. And by the way, what were they there for? Can you guys tell me what do you think the mission was? Why would you send a PLA unit after the New York Times? What's the biggest concern you'd have? Publicity, situational awareness. Oh, negative publicity. What negative publicity? What does that mean? Yes. Yes. Yes, so the comment was, we want to know what's coming down the pike so we can prepare ourselves for it, and so we can have a counter story ready to go. What else would you want to know? Yeah, that's the one. You want to know who is spilling the beans on the Wen family finances. You want sources and methods, because once you get sources, what are you going to do to them? Well, you might kill them. You're probably going to arrest them. You're going to arrest them, and then you're probably going to twist their arms until they recant and say, we made it all up. Turns out the sources in this case were a very interesting mix of data that was publicly available, but it was protected by one of the most amazing defense systems ever created. Anyone want to guess what that defense system was? It was the Chinese language. All you had to do was be able to read Chinese and get into the right databases, which were all public, and you could read everything about the Wen family finances. So it turns out the sources and methods that the APT-12 actors were going after were public. You just had to be able to read Chinese. And these two reporters that were targeted were the current and former bureau chiefs in Beijing, so they knew how to read Chinese, and it was no problem. So 2 weeks to get to the domain controller. A couple of other interesting tidbits about this. There were periods during this intrusion, which incidentally lasted a 4-month period from September to when we eventually kicked them out in late December. There were periods when the attackers took up to 2 weeks off. In other words, no activity for 2 weeks. Maybe they were going back for more taskings. Maybe they were trying to digest what they had already stolen. We don't know. But again, during that 2-week period, maybe it's vacation, right? I mean, there's a reason why we released the APT-1 report during Chinese New Year. We figured it would hit those guys where they're all on vacation, right? Just like they hit us Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, all the time. So that story, and by the way, we ended up kicking them out end of December. New York Times decided they were going to publish a story about this, and it came live in January of 2013. So there's some interesting elements about this. So the first one, that it's easy. If they had just patched themselves. From all indications, the New York Times was not necessarily a totally easy target. I've done a little bit of backstory research on them. They actually had a CISO. The CISO was public about his support from the board. This is all several years before it happened. It was public about their support from the board. They had an MSSP, which is even going another step forward. That's sort of acknowledging, look, we're doing what we can, but we want another level of top cover. MSSP wasn't that effective, but okay. So that whole easy part, I think I can make a case against that. By the way, this is just one case. We're just using this to pull out some ideas. Let's go to the speed part. This attack wasn't one and done. This wasn't like, we're in, we grab what we need, we're done. It took weeks for these guys to leverage the access that they needed in order to get to the data, which incidentally they never even reached. They never actually reached the sources for the two reporters. So in that sense, they were kind of failures. So who knows what happened to those guys. And then the final one, the hopeless part, this is where I hope you think, or you're starting to get a sense now that I think hopeless should not be part of your vocabulary in this domain. The reason is, tactically, at the point where there's a skirmish between you and the adversary, yeah, there's a good chance the adversary, if they come prepared and they know what software you're running and they've got an O-day for it and you've got no mitigating controls and nobody's watching, yeah, tactically, they're probably going to win that tactical engagement. But when you pull back and you look at the operational considerations and you consider what's going to happen over hours, days, weeks, months, and if you can interdict the adversary before he accomplishes his mission, from an operational level of war, I think you can win. The problem is, of course, that not everybody can operate at this level. Now, the good part is you're in an organization which I believe has the resources and the skill and all that to do operationally good counter-intrusion campaigns. Whether that model scales to everyone, I think, is an open question. That's, I'm not that optimistic for very, very small organizations, but for larger ones, I think it's doable. So I have 3 seconds left. At this point, I'm supposed to stop and ask for if there are any questions.